The story of Jesus has appropriated these images. Jesus doesn't just reject them, sideline them, say, no, leave all that behind. No, no, no. Marcion was an early Christian who thought that the Old Testament was talking about a different God, and Jesus represented the true God, who was here to defeat the false god of Israel. The church rejected that wholeheartedly. No, Jesus is the God of Israel. Jesus doesn't set aside all those old hopes and promises and say, that was on the wrong track. The gospel appropriates them, but it transforms them. It reshapes them. Takes them through Atlanta to a new destination. And as a result, the whole New Testament shares Israel's apocalyptic perspective of God behind the scenes working his plan to fulfillment. And the New Testament is thoroughly Christ-centered. And this is so obvious that it hardly needs to be stated, right? Duh, the New Testament's about Jesus. But this is why Jesus is the answer to every Sunday school question. Jesus is the answer to every Sunday school question because Jesus is the center of all things. That's the conclusion that the church is just led to in view of his ascension and session as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. There's wackiness in the New Testament woven through this, but the overall sense remains what I've just described. And if you take church history, you'll learn that there's different cultural, local flavors of wackiness all through the centuries in different places, in Ireland and Russia, in Nubia, everywhere. Don't let that stuff throw you. It's just people being, people, the way Michael Shermer said it would be. But it's been reshaped into a firm hope that's not dysfunctional. I'm going to describe the texture of healthy Christian eschatology as a probiotic. You know what a probiotic is? If you're taking antibiotics, they wipe out your gut flora, which you need to have a normal digestive system. And so the doctor will tell you to eat yogurt or to take probiotics, which are little living bacteria that you need. They're the good ones. And you need the good bacteria to keep away the bad bacteria from taking over and ruining your life. I think the gospel is a probiotic. The gospel is a probiotic for our eschatologies. It checks our wackiness. It decenters it. Actually, it recenters it on Christ's reign. And it reshapes our hopes accordingly and restores their health. It doesn't remove our wackiness. It just helps heal it. What happens to this general Christian eschatological sense is it's solidified in the texts of the end of the Creed. Jesus will return in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. And under the heading of the Holy Spirit, we believe in the Holy Spirit and the Holy Catholic Church, the fellowship of saints, in the Nicene Creed, one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. We look forward to the resurrection of the body and the life of the end, life everlasting. Life of the age to come. That's what Nicene Creed says. Those are all expressions of this kind of fundamental Christian eschatological hope. However, they get less healthy and actually less coherent as the church moves farther and farther away from its Jewish roots. Because the Jewish worldview is what made these things, it's their original home and it's their biblical expression. So as the church gets more and more Gentile, You got to move away from resurrection and to disembodied afterlives of souls in heaven or hell. Instead of baptism being the beginning of a new life, baptism ends up happening to every infant without qualification, and it just becomes a badge of citizenship in a civil realm. What you get is a kind of disintegrating of Christian hope as the apocalyptic perspective fades. As the Gentile church moves farther and farther away from the Jewish culture that produced these texts, it gets harder and harder to understand them. And a different story, really a Platonistic story of our soul's ascent back to their source, almost a Gnostic meta-narrative, reasserts itself in Christian folk religion. That spiritualism that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, that gets more and more powerful as the church's Jewishness gets farther and farther away and its memory fades. And renewal movements don't really recover more than pieces of this. And a different story, really a Platonistic story of our soul's ascent back to their source, almost a Gnostic meta-narrative, reasserts itself in Christian folk religion. That spiritualism that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, that gets more and more powerful as the church's Jewishness gets farther and farther away and its memory fades. And renewal movements don't really recover more than pieces of this. New Testament scholarship in the 21st century is in a better position than in probably 1900 years to appreciate the Jewishness of the New Testament, to recover the historical and cultural sensibilities of its writers and its audiences. And that has put us in a wonderful position to understand these things better than we would have 200 or 300 years ago. But it's kind of new information, and so this is kind of a frontier for Christian theology to recover a more Jewish apocalyptic and therefore a more originally Christian apocalyptic perspective. It excites me. And so pay attention in those New Testament courses as you learn a way of reading these things more faithfully. And finally, the overall effect of apocalyptic, comforting, encouraging, warning offers this quite sensible, quite non-wacky ethic for people living in between the old and the new. And that is this. This is how Jesus punctuates his little apocalyptic discourse in Mark 13. He says, stay awake, watch. You don't know when the end is coming. So be ready and stay ready and live in anticipation of that event. And if you want to know what that looks like, look at the Montecito Fire Department. They never know when the bell's going to ring, and so they always live ready for that alarm. Stay awake. Watch. That is what it means to live under apocalyptic hope.